Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update, the second part thereof for the 17th of July 2025. This is a Geopolitics update. We're going to be looking at the news concerning the Ukraine war in the context of Europe, the United States, etc. I'm going to start with the EU. That will not yet approve its 18th sanctions package. This seems to be rumbling on for a long time. Slovakia is the main culprit, Malta involved as well, but I think now mainly Slovakia again. So Slovakia and Malta have not yet lifted their restrictions, and that was on the 15th. So that was 2 days, a day and a half ago. And actually since then we have heard that it's once again failed. According to Reuters, EU ambassadors were unable to unblock Slovakia's veto and get Slovakia to work in accordance with the rest of the EU. So they are the difficult ones there. Viktor Orban, I mean, that's really frustrating because that it's just an absolute gimme. That should be done. And what Slovakia are upset about is if they are forcibly weaned off Russian hydrocarbons, is the EU going to essentially, the way I understand it anyway, is the EU going to compensate them if there are higher costs involved? So you can understand from an economic point of view why they might be a little bit perturbed about this. It will cost them extra. But on the other hand, Russia are on the edge of Europe, threatening menacingly. And, you know, Europe needs to work together to sanction Russia. And they are, I'm pretty sure they're economically in an awfully bad position at the moment. Now, Viktor Orban, the Hungarian leader, has called on the EU to impose sanctions, not against Russia, but against Ukraine over the death of an ethnic Hungarian who was conscripted in Zakarpattia. This has caused a bit of an uproar for Orban, who has now, I think, last I heard an hour or so ago, has sanctioned 3 Ukrainian generals or something like that associated with this, what he thinks is a scandal. That he's asking the EU to actually properly sanction Ukraine. The EU has slapped new sanctions on Russia, even though they haven't got the 18th package through. These are separate ones on Russia over hybrid threats and disinformation. The new restrictive measures target actors involved in what the EU described as foreign information manipulation and interference. This is FIMI. Talked about this previously. So H.I. Sutton refers to a military news post saying the European Union has announced sanctions against Russian individuals and organisations whose activities are aimed at jamming GPS in Europe. Sanctions will target the 841st Separate Electronic Warfare Centre and 2 senior members of the staff who oversee the operations in the Kaliningrad region. So sort of going after disinformation and hybrid warfare efforts with sanctions here, the EU. So that's good news if they can still get other sanctions put in place, even if they can't get the 18th package of the full economic sanctions rolled out at the moment. That's really frustrating. Russia's systematically important banks are discussing bailout within the next year, according to Bloomberg. Behind closed doors, some of Russia's biggest banks worry that far more of their loans could go sour than official figures dictate, Bloomberg has reported. If you want to keep a little bit of a handle on what's going on in terms of the Russian economy, Prune 60 on Blue Sky is just voluminous in terms of output to do with the Russian economy. Just look at the last few threads. Russian economy threatens fuel stock. Rostat records sharp acceleration in gasoline price growth. Every 4th pair of shoes in Russia turned out to be counterfeit. The whole thing on shoe production and shoe imports. Russia's largest banks are preparing to ask the state for help due to sharp increase in bad debts. This is all just in the last couple of hours. And then, you know, some stats there on inflation and whatnot. Minister of Finance for Russia has said, that's Anton Siluanov, implementation of some infrastructure projects may be postponed, and so on and so forth. It's just relentless in terms of the news concerning the Russian economy. Anyway, to go back to where I was, we're going to go to Kaja Kallas now in EU, saying it's unbearable. She's talking about, well, she's raising an alarm over Russia's escalating use of chemical warfare in Ukraine. Quote, again, it shows that Russia wants to cause as much pain and suffering as possible so that Ukraine would surrender. She's a very strong advocate for Ukraine, of course. Right, starting in 2026, says now reports, Ukrainian refugees in Germany will face stricter requirements to receive Bürgergeld social benefits. According to Chancellor Merz, the message is clear. To keep the support, one must be ready to work. I don't know enough about the details here, but I'm sure it's like keeping people on the right happy. Obviously, he's a centre-right leader. But AFD, I think, have gone back up in the polls just recently. And I don't know if that has anything to do with this or whether this was always something that they were going to implement. You know, now that the war is 3.5 years in the make, or 3.5 years old in its latest iteration. Refugees, that initial obvious kindness to refugees in terms of welfare is probably something that's being tightened up across a number of nations now. Okay, going on to Finland. Finland bans Russians and Belarusians from buying property over security concerns. A new Finnish law barring real estate purchases by Russian and Belarusian citizens took effect on July the 15th as part of efforts to strengthen their national security. And then we move on to, this is a bit of bad news as far as Denmark is concerned. We heard the other day that a Spanish company was still able to get a big old rotary forge or whatever it was, some big piece of machinery that enables the Russians to manufacture barrels, as in artillery barrels and whatnot. Here we hear a subsidiary of Danish inspection company Baltic Control helped Russian firms export over 172,000 tons of grain from occupied Berdyansk between March 2024 and May 2025, according to leaked documents obtained by Ukrainian investigators. So a Danish company hopefully going to come under some scrutiny there from Danish authorities and Danish population too, one would hope. French Aid Ukraine reports that, and this is very interesting, in 2024, France was the second most affected country by information manipulation originating from Russia, with 21.2% of attacks. It far surpassed its European Union neighbours. Only Ukraine at 37.4% was affected more. I mean, it's just an incredible number. I mean, look at Mali, 7.6%, Burkina Faso, 4%, Niger, 6.6%. They're really high there relatively, because you think that all of those three are higher than Spain and Belgium, and even, Germany's at 8.1%. US, all three of those Burkina Faso not, but Niger and Mali, more so than the United States there in terms of the most affected company by Russian disinformation. But France, way out in the lead there. And that shows you how important France is. Like we non-French people, sometimes sort of, don't realise how much they're right in the middle of particularly the information cyber war. We know that Emmanuel Macron has been very strong rhetorically, and there's an awful lot the French, I think, are doing behind the scenes and in terms of pulling the strings, even if they haven't been as forthcoming with military materiel as much as, say, Germany. But they are right in the middle of it, and I think Macron has been sounding that alarm. He has. The problem is you've got this surging support for Rassemblement National, who are inclined to align themselves more likely with Russia. Then you have, I think, is it LFI in France on the left, likewise not particularly enamored by Ukraine. So yeah, it's a real challenge there in France as to where they're going to be going, particularly after 2027 with a new president. Hopefully Gabriel Attal can replace Emmanuel Macron as a kind of centrist, centre-right, rather than the full-on right-winger. UK and Germany are to sign a historic mutual defence pact amid Russian aggression, according to Bloomberg. The agreement reflects growing concerns across Europe over Russian military aggression and doubts that the US commitment to NATO will remain under President Donald Trump. So this is really good. We are seeing, like I keep talking about, a closer alignment of the UK with much of the rest of Europe. We've had recent close working between Emmanuel Macron and Starmer, as Macron had his state visit. Keir Starmer really looking to Europe to do closer deals. We've got a defence pact with the EU, and the ability, I think, is now cemented in there. I think, given the pacts that we've been doing, but the ability for our defence contractors to be able to tender for the ReArm 2030 European funding, 150 billion euros initially, could be raising to 800 billion, rising to. We are able to have a piece of that funding. Our BAE systems and whatever other producers are going to be able to bid for that work, because we're getting closer. It's interesting that we are using this. I don't know. Part of me wonders whether, sorry, and I'm thinking out loud here, Labour, when they came in, recognised that we had to get closer to Europe and is using the war in Ukraine as a vehicle to get closer with Europe without raising too many concerns from staunch leavers and anti-EU Eurosceptics. Say, look, we've got to, and it is true, none of this is kind of like untrue. There isn't a sense of manipulation here or underhand machinations. This is genuinely, we need to get closer to Europe for economic reasons, but using the war in Ukraine as kind of cover almost for getting closer to, even though it's justified, it's like, oh, thank goodness this has come along. We can get closer to Europe and then fulfill certain economic goals that we want from a closer relationship with Europe, and use the cover of defence and geopolitical strategizing concerning the threat of Russia. So anyway, Starmer described the agreement as a historic document which really measures just how close our countries are and our ambition for the future. The treaty reinforces existing NATO obligations. Officials from both governments emphasised it is not a substitute for the alliance's Article 5. So it did sound like in some initial reports, it's like, we're going to come to your aid if you get invaded, and you can come to ours, a mutual defence assistance sort of agreement. It's the most significant bilateral pact between the two nations since 1945, which surprised Merz, learning it was the first such agreement since World War II, adding, quote, "We had you in the European Union and we thought that was enough, but we are now learning that it's not enough, so we have to do more on that." The accord, signed during a ceremony at London's Victoria and Albert Museum, is based on groundwork laid by Starmer and Merz's predecessor Olaf Scholz during a 2023 meeting in Berlin. The treaty marks a deepening of post-Brexit relations and growing strategic alignment between London and Berlin. One of the key components of the deal is a joint pledge to deliver a new long-range missile system, the Deep Precision Strike capability, within the next decade. The system, with a range exceeding 2,000 kilometres, is expected to drive substantial industrial investment into European defence sectors. That is, although nuclear weapons are not explicitly mentioned in the text, the deal carries heightened importance for Germany, which lacks its own nuclear arsenal and relies on a deterrent umbrella of the US and Europe's two nuclear states, the UK and France. It's an important agreement, I would have thought, between the two nations there. Now, going to Ukraine, I have told you that there's a new prime minister, there's a new defense minister. It looks like there's a new ambassador. And it's not Rustem Umerov, actually, is the ambassador. So breaking news, says a Kyiv Independent. Ukraine's parliament approves a new prime minister in a major government reshuffle. The Ukrainian parliament voted on July the 17th to confirm Yulia Sviridenko as the new prime minister in the major cabinet reshuffle. We also understand that Ukraine has now appointed a new special envoy to the US, so I believe that's effectively the ambassador. And this is Ola Stefanishina. She's a seasoned diplomat, says the Kyiv Independent, and expert in European and Euro-Atlantic integration. She's held top government roles since 2020, so that could be what we know it's a super important role. It could be a good appointment. I don't know enough about her. It's a super important role because she has to cozy up to the Americans and get as much out of America as possible. Not just in terms of material and aid and whatnot, but as much support. She needs to be able to generate support, particularly in Republican ranks, for Ukraine. And then Denis Shmyhal, who's a former prime minister, replaced by Svyridenko, he then becomes the defense minister, and he has set out his priorities: full support for the Ukrainian soldier and raising the share of domestically produced weapons at the front from 40% to 50% within 6 months. He promises a fast, transparent and effective ministry built to win the war. So he's got a really big job ahead of him. And then Rustem Umerov, it appears, is not going to be defense minister. Obviously, he was defense minister. He's not going to be the US ambassador, but might well be something along the lines of a national security council advisor or something like that. There are a few claims. So, I've just got this slightly out of order, but talking about Stefanishina, she'll be Ukraine's next ambassador to the US, says Christopher Miller. Zelensky has now confirmed it. Until Washington approves her, she will serve as Zelensky's special envoy. That's why she's called special envoy, because until she's definitely the ambassador, that's her title. For US cooperation, she was previously vice prime minister for Euro integration and key to fulfilling requirements for EU membership. So she's, evidently got some decent pedigree there. Now, going across to Russia and then the United States, concerning the 50 days that Trump has given Russia to, bow down to negotiations and agreements. The Russians are openly and literally casually joking about Trump's deadline, says this source. They basically think he is an utter moron who can be manipulated at will, and to this day it's still true. Feituk's network says 50 days before, this is a quote from Lavrov, 50 days before that it was 24 hours, and then 100 days. We've been through all of this before. He says, so he's a bit sort of mocking of the 50 days commandment from the US, the ultimatum. So it's a bit of a slap around the face, or at least it could be. It depends how much the Americans are paying attention to the Russians. I mean, goodness me, if you were to take someone like Dmitry Medvedev seriously, you'd be in a war on day one. I mean, he's pretty explicitly extreme in his views about the US and about Europe and Ukraine. And so maybe the Americans are ignoring these kind of barbed comments. But Sergei Lavrov he's been around the block a few times. He knows how to do this. But yeah, they don't seem overly concerned with the 50-day deadline. Now, into schizo here, as the source says, now because Trump has said now because Trump has said it, so 65% of his base now agrees with sending weapons to Ukraine. This is a 43-point increase. And I brought this up yesterday in my military aid video because this is super freaking important. If Trump says it's good, then his followers say it's good. I talked a little bit about divine command theory and this kind of might is right approach to, whatever Trump says must be right because Trump has said it. So if Trump was saying aid to Ukraine was bad beforehand, then it was bad. And if he's now just changed his mind there and says we now need to give aid to Ukraine and it's good, it must now be good because Trump arbitrates morality for his supporters. And that seems to be borne out by the evidence here. where support to give weapons to Ukraine among Trump voters, when they were told it was Trump's decision, the support went up 43 points to 65% and opposed it 22%. So important for the Trump base, what Trump says, obviously, but it's emphatic, that, isn't it? Now, the moment Trump was elected and I love this comment from Jimmy Rushton, who's a security analyst in Kiev. This is absolutely on point. The moment Trump was elected by the American people, the one job the Ukrainian government had was to minimize the damage he could do to Ukraine. And they're doing a relatively good job. Personal feelings about Trump are entirely irrelevant. This is absolutely right. Put aside whatever you think about Trump. And you know my feelings about him. They're very, very clear. But surely everyone can agree that Trump coming in was a real challenge for the Ukrainians. You saw the ambush in February in the Oval Office of Zelensky. You've seen the rhetoric be distinctly anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian appeasement. You've heard J.D. Vance and all sorts of figures outside of just Trump himself be pretty critical of Ukraine. Ukraine's job as soon as Trump got in was damage limitation. Now, you can argue that the Oval Office was a bit of some might say it's a cock-up on Zelensky's part, even though I think he was ambushed by those two people. Could he have played that better? But other than that, or at least since then, Ukraine have done a tremendous job to just appease the US as much as possible and to limit the damage that Trump could do to Ukraine. So I think this is so on point. The moment Trump was elected by the American people, the one job the Ukrainian government had was to minimize the damage he could do to Ukraine, and they're doing a relatively good job. Absolutely. Now, the US State Department has fired Russia and Ukraine analysts in the recent layoffs, according to the New York Times. This comes as Marco Rubio is attempting to offload 15%, I think, of the State Department's rosters. It's very easy to just be super, super critical of the Trump administration in what they're doing in stripping out all sorts of what they would see as inefficiencies and essentially just sacking a whole load of people, having Doge cut their way through government kind of arbitrarily. And it's been a real mess. But it doesn't mean that the intentions aren't sometimes on point. So there have been many who have said, look, the State Department in the US is pretty bloated, and there's some redundancy there where there's overlap and inefficiencies. And I was listening to an analysis yesterday that said what's going to be interesting is if the Democrats, say, for example, the Democrats got back in 2028, is whether they would just put everything back as it was and kind of ignore any issues that were underwriting some justified complaints and criticisms. They just put Humpty Dumpty back together again, just as was, or would they take an opportunity to go, well, actually, although we disagree with the way they did this, some of the things, there were some certain areas of the US government that did need trimming and reforming, and the State Department has long been thought to be one of those. So Marco Rubio is going about making some pretty swinging cuts. The problem is there are certain areas where some of that expertise is really freaking useful. And one of those areas might well be the Ukraine department. So they are laying off Russia and Ukraine analysts, probably at a time where I'd say they were some of the most important in the kind of what we would call the Foreign Office. Right. I was thinking about, should I include this? I mean, I'm including it because Mike Waltz was so important for Ukraine, or not for Ukraine, like he being a national security advisor. Ukraine is right at the top of the agenda, and Mike Waltz was thought to be someone who might help Ukraine a little bit because he's sort of sensible. But then we had Signalgate, and he fell by the wayside. But it turns out that the former national security advisor is still getting paid the full wage by the looks of it. This is Senator Rosen in a hearing.
This morning it was reported, despite being removed from your role as national security advisor in May, removed from your role, right? Not working. Surprisingly, you've been on the White House payroll for the last few months. So throughout this hearing, you've made assertions that if confirmed, you would root out waste and unnecessary overhead at the UN. So can you confirm for us whether you've been receiving a salary from the White House since being let go at the NSA?
Thank you, Senator. I was not fired. The president never said that, nor did the vice president. I was kept on as an advisor, transitioning a number of important activities, and now hope to be confirmed with the Senate's consent.
So you were not dismissed from your role, as was publicly reported, because it's also been publicly reported that you've been receiving almost $200,000 of the taxpayer money since you were dismissed from being the national security advisor.
Well, the reporting, Senator, is fake news, which shouldn't surprise anyone. The president was clear. His announcement was, I will nominate
fake news
Mr. Waltz,
and
then the vice president was quite...
And I wanted to play that out because that last sentence, and this is kind of relevant for another video, I was looking for this snippet to play in a video I've already recorded, haven't released it yet, on Trump's... the normalization of Trump's rhetoric and things he does and says. And so many people in the Trump administration, when there's any criticism that comes against Trump, they go fake news. Oh, this is fake news. Pete Hegseth, whenever there's a difficult question, oh, it's fake news. No, it's not. Like, that was what's reported. Like, deal with it. Like, tell us how it's wrong. Are you getting $200,000 a year still for your role? And if you are, explain why you are, and that's fine. That's what we're here for. And if you're not getting that, then you can say that was incorrect. But just by having an answer, that's fake news. What do you mean by that? And it's really frustrating that is becoming more and more of a pat answer that you're hearing. Just whenever there's something difficult, oh, fake news. And what is it? So you're saying it is not true? Are you actually saying it's not true? Because then we need to bottom out exactly, what you're calling essentially a lie. I mean, are you saying that this is a lie, or is this just a way of excusing yourself from having to answer a difficult question? Okay, we're going to go on to just a very, very short while. I mean, this concerns BRICS. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and many other nations that have kind of affiliated with that or joined in. So I don't know if they're going to call that BRICS forever, even if there are like 20 countries, and it'll still just be called BRICS. But you've got this situation where the US sees China as an adversary, the present US administration, and as their number one kind of concern. And at the same time as they see China as their number one concern, they're doing things to other nations that are pushing those nations closer to China. So there is a foreign policy approach in the US that is counterproductive and achieving exactly the opposite of what they want. And they're slapping 50% tariffs on Brazil because, and it's now been pretty much admitted, it's got nothing to do with reciprocal tariffs. It's got nothing to do with trade deficits because they have a trade surplus, the Brazilians, with the US. The Brazilians buy more from the US than the US buy from Brazil. And so those two things are not relevant for why Trump's put tariffs on them. He's put tariffs on Brazil, 50%, like huge tariffs on them, because Jair Bolsonaro, their autocratic-leaning former leader, is facing a court case, and this concerns sort of January the 6th style insurrection that was done on his behalf, and he's facing the courts. And Trump said, right, if you don't take that court case down, if you don't start treating Bolsonaro nicely, then I'm sorry, you're going to have 50% tariffs whacked on you. And of course, what that does is it pushes Brazil closer to China, as they're seeking to find alternatives to either buy their stuff, so they're no longer going to buy as much stuff from the US. If you whack tariffs on them, they've got a trade surplus with you. They're going to go and buy that stuff from somewhere else. They'll be like, screw you then. Then you are pushing them politically closer to China, which is exactly what you don't want. You're pushing them closer to Russia. You are possibly even pushing them closer to the EU. And the EU that you've whacked 30% tariffs on, you might have a situation where Brazil and the EU decide to do the business that it used to be doing between like the US. And so the US trade wars at the moment appear to be so ill thought out. This is Trump on Brazil.
We are doing it because I'm able to do it. Nobody else would be able to do it.
And this is an absolutely outrageous answer. And I have to just emphasize this to give you a sense of who Trump is and what he's like. So asked about the rationale for putting tariffs on Brazil, he says, well, so why are you doing it? Because I'm able to do it. Nobody else would do it. I'm doing it because I can. Nah. 50% tariffs. Bah, screw you, Brazil.
We are doing it because I'm able to do it. Nobody else would be able to do it. We have tariffs going on because we want tariffs and we want the money.
We're doing it because I can. Why are you doing it? Well, because we want to. Yeah, but why do you want to? Because we want to. Look, why do you want to? Because we can. Yeah, but why? So annoying.
Coming into the United States. But more important than the money, there's two aspects to tariff. There's the money, which comes in. The other aspect is that rather than paying the tariffs, the country or the company will build in the United States, make their product in the United States, and that creates jobs. And I would say of the two, probably the more important to me is that, yeah.
Well, it's really interesting. Like I've said to you before, it is an either or. You can't have, well, both of those things they are mutually exclusive, because you either continue to buy stuff from Brazil, in this case, with tariffs whacked on, and you're making money out of the tariffs, except that's a tax to your consumer, or you are onshoring the jobs and therefore not demanding that because you're making it now in the US, and therefore you're not buying the stuff from Brazil. But you can't both onshore that manufacturing and get money for the tariffs. That doesn't make sense. But anyway, he's doing it because he can. Right, now, it's counterproductive, because rather than support Bolsonaro, this has actually spiked Lula, the leader of Brazil, spiked his approval ratings. So days after Mr. Trump's tariff threats, Mr. Lula's approval ratings rose to their highest level in months. If you are going to attack nations with tariffs, those nations, the same happened with Canada. Those nations are going to unite, and then they're going to think you are the enemy, and then all of your intentions fall by the wayside because it's all very counterproductive. Anyway, we are now, what are we looking at? Yes, so why... Okay, so this is a little bit, this is quite a long, this is 4 minutes worth. I don't know if it's worth playing. But I've talked to you a number of times about how the US has defunded or closed down the department that is looking into the war crimes of the Russians in Ukraine. And it's a real indication is, what side the Americans are trying to be on. This is Representative Keating, it's not a senator actually, speaking to the State Department official Michael Regas about this.
So I want to ask you this question. Why did you fire the entire team investigating war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine? Why were those people fired?
Sir, I believe that office was consolidated, and the work of that office, it will be conducted by the regional bureau and by the staff at posts overseas.
Now, all of this is fine. People are let go from there that we're assisting. I worked with the prosecutor from Ukraine as they were training their own people to deal with these. Here's the kind of crimes that they've been committing. They've been committing serial rapes of teenagers by Russian soldiers. They were targeting maternity wards of hospitals. They were targeting emergency responders coming to the aid to give medical care to these innocent people that were being attacked.
So on and so forth. He goes to town on this guy, and it's really good to see that there are people that still really care for the plight of the Ukrainians, and it just seems unconscionable that you'd be closing down departments that are looking into horrific war crimes by the Russians. But yeah. Right, last couple of things, just going slightly off piste, only because I keep talking about the rise of populism in the UK, how Reform are riding high. They're probably going to win or at least massively affect the next elections in the UK, even though they're sort of 3 years away. Reform, I think people just have very short-termist thinking, and we're in a very populist mindset whereby we find it very attractive to hear really oversimplistic answers to very complex problems, especially when it involves we're much more susceptible to fear than to joy. We saw that in the US election, the last election. Everything seemed to be about scapegoating immigrants, etc., etc. And I have said that Reform UK in the UK is MAGA 2.0, that Donald Trump's MAGA republicanism has been exported to a number of nations around the world, and it is attractive for certain people. And in the UK, there are people who are loving a bit of MAGA. We have, and I said that Reform are the UK's MAGA, and I was taken to task by a commenter when I first made this claim, except I hit back with the receipts because I got the receipts there. You know, when Nigel Farage goes around these rallies with a MAGA hat that's in Reform turquoise, he's had a special hat made that is MAGA for Reform. When he's going to rallies for a start, supporting Trump and then advocating for all of Trump's policies. And then when you look at the Reform policies, whether it be tax on renewables, whether it be Doge they've got Doge units going into county councils that they control. You know that Reform is just a form of MAGA. It just is. Anyway, this is very well accepted now. The Guardian article here: will Nigel Farage's attempt to copy and paste Trump's policies work in the UK? And that's going to be interesting because Trump is generally seen as a dingbat in the UK. He's got real negative approval, even amongst Reform. Like, I know some Reform voters, certainly will be Reform voters, I think, in the next election, family members and whatnot, who none of them like Trump, but they will vote Reform, and they would probably vote Reform even if it took on Trump's policies. Because I don't think they think that deeply about, it's all about identity and it's about anti-woke, even though I've heard relatives talk about woke, and I've said, what do you mean by woke? And they can't really put it into words. It's just like copying and pasting ideas they hear off the internet and just regurgitating them. And I just think that is real simplistic populism that I can see working on family members. And I think it's dangerous. And I think, 3 years' time in the UK, we are going to have a Reform to deal with that will be the sort of populism that Europe is dealing with, majorly in terms of AFD and Rassemblement National and all of these, I think, MAGA carbon copies around Europe. It's just, I say MAGA carbon copies. MAGA is just a form of right-wing populism, and that is what is sweeping the world at the moment. Now, you can say, well, we need to deal with the underlying issues of that, say immigration and whatnot, but these are being amplified. There's a lot of manipulation, there's a lot of disinformation, and there's a lot of oversimplifying of very complex issues and offering simple but actually largely inadequate solutions to those problems. The other thing I wanted to just touch on right at the end here now is the Israeli bombing of Syria that took place yesterday. That is just horrific. And some people are saying you spend all this time on Ukraine. Why don't you ever do videos on Israel? It's like, I'm one human being. Stop hassling me to report on an entirely other conflict. If you think that conflict is more important, then you go and start a YouTube channel up and talk about that conflict. I have my views on Israel. I think the Israeli government is pretty horrific. I think Hamas are horrific, but I think what the Israeli government have done to what Hamas did, which was horrific on October the 7th, has been genocidal. I think Benjamin Netanyahu should go to prison. I think this is completely counterproductive. So Syria, just trying to find its feet, is getting Damascus and their general staff offices bombed by Israel in the middle of the day. Like, this is not acceptable. But I don't have time to understand and research the nuances. Like, if you want me to do videos on Israel and Gaza, then I'm going to have to sit there and do another 10 hours of research every day on the intricacies of Netanyahu's court case and research all the sources on what's going on in Gaza. I don't have the time. So please, please, please do not hassle me to saying I should be doing videos on this. Why aren't you doing that? Because I'm one human being. And it's this idea that you should only be able to report, if you're saying that I should not be reporting on Ukraine because you think Gaza is more important, then that's to say that all news agencies shouldn't report on anything but Gaza. It should be the only thing that anyone ever thinks about. You shouldn't do anything at home. Rather, you shouldn't feed your children. You should just be watching the news on Gaza. Do you know what I mean? It's like, we specialize in different areas. And there'll be some YouTube channels that are specializing on climate change and biodiversity and news in science and, I don't know, genetic research. You don't go to them and say, why are you doing videos on genetic research and not on Israel and Gaza? Because my expertise in this area and this is what I want to do and blah, blah, blah. It's not that I don't care about Israel and Gaza. It's not I don't have an opinion on that. It's that this is what I do. Anyway, that's my closing rant there. But however, it is important to understand that all these things connect in this spider web of geopolitics. And I am not a fan of what Israel is doing at the moment. And it's even worse when you hear stuff like this. So the Israeli government has been lobbying the USA to keep Russian bases in Syria. So considering how Israel has regularly been ignoring European interests and instead being friendly with Russia, says Jakub Janowski from Oryx here. In my opinion, they should be banned from all our military procurement. Wow. So this is from Reuters. Turkey has said it wants Syria to become more stable and pose no threat to its neighbours. It has repeatedly said Israel's actions in southern Syria were part of its expansionist and invasive policy and showed Israel did not want regional peace. To contain Turkey, Israeli officials have sought to persuade US officials that Russia should keep its Mediterranean naval base in Syria's Tartus province and its Khmeimim air base in Latakia province, the sources said. When Israeli officials presented Russia's continued presence in a positive light in a meeting with US officials, some attendees were surprised, arguing that Turkey, a NATO member, would be a better guarantor of Israel's security, two of the US sources said. This is bad news. Bad news for Ukraine that Israel actually looks at Russia favorably. This is a problem. Anyway, that's enough from me. I really appreciate your support. Remember, there is a campaign that we're doing at the moment, atpgeo.com/donate, and you will be taken to the Jigaspor Drone Lab page, whereby we are raising money for drones. You can look at your menu, pick from different drones, drone components, and help out there with these different sort of different aspects of drones. So I'm going to be speaking hopefully to a chap called Bogdan and Irina, possibly from Jigaspor, and we're going to be talking about the campaign relatively soon. But any help with that will be gratefully received. Thank you very much. Take care. I'll speak to you soon.